You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
What does Sputnik have to do with student loans? How did a set of trembling hands end the Soviet Union? How did inflation kill moon bases? And how did a former president decide to run for a second non-consecutive term? These are among the topics we deal with on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. We tell stories of history that relate to today's news events. Give a listen. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, wherever you get podcasts.
Hello everyone, Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. Today, I'm joined by Timothy Manion, the author of Why Barbarossa Failed, Germany and Russia in the Second World War, which releases March 5th, 2026, which means it should be out right now if you're listening to this on the day that the episode released. Timothy, thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you, Wesley. Good to be here.
What was kind of the reason that you wrote this book? What made you sit down and decide, hey, I want to write a book on Barbarossa, specifically targeted on why it was a failure?
So something always seemed off to me when I read traditional secondary accounts of Operation Barbarossa. If you read most books on Operation Barbarossa, it's kind of bizarre. They don't really talk about the major battles and fighting that took place between the German army and the Red Army during the war. They usually talk about things like the tremendous distances involved, poor infrastructure and terrain of the Soviet Union, of course, the weather it's talked about at length, and then, of course, logistics comes up and intelligence. But in terms of the actual fighting that took place between the two armies, there's surprisingly very little literature about that. If you think, what were the major battles that took place during Operation Barbarossa? I think the only two that have really gotten any attention are the early battle in June at Brody Dubno, where supposedly the largest tank battle in history took place. Just, recently there have been several books on that. And then the other battle that gets talked about is the Battle of Smolensk, where in the past 2 decades, we've had great books by David Stahlhill, David Glantz, and Craig Luther. But other than those 2 battles, and then, of course, the encirclement battle of Kiev, you don't hear very much about how the German army and the Red Army actually fought against each other. And that always struck me as pretty odd. And it was only when I started reading, David Glantz's series on the Battle of Smolensk that I realized, there's this entirely different aspect to the campaign beyond just, the dirt roads of the Soviet Union were difficult on German vehicles and they broke down, and these immense clouds of dust clogged the engines of German vehicles, and that's why they couldn't bring enough fuel and ammunition to the front. And I think the common narrative we hear is that the German army was tremendously proficient at fighting tactical battles, and early in the war they were fighting countries very close to their own border, Poland and France, with very short distances and better infrastructure. And in those battles, the German army was tremendously proficient tactically, and, outclassed its opponents. And the problem in the Soviet Union, according to the traditional narrative, is, well, now they've got this tremendous distance they have to cover, and the infrastructure is so poor, and the terrain is so difficult, and the weather is either too hot or too cold, that the German army can't fight to its potential because of all these sort of forces of nature. And it really, in most accounts of Operation Barbarossa, is described as sort of a man against nature campaign rather than man against man. So again, it's really when I was reading David Glantz's series on Smolensk that I realized, well, actually there was this important man against man, army against army aspect to the campaign. And Unfortunately, with the Soviet archives being closed and David Glantz being retired, we might not get another David Glantz in our lifetimes who can bring this side of the story to light. So I wanted to learn more about this sort of army versus army aspect of the campaign. And to do that, really the only source out there is David Glantz's book on Smolensk. And when I was studying that book, a lot of questions jumped out at me regarding the way in particular that the German army handled the movement of its panzer divisions. In the traditional account of Barbarossa, we're told that the German army was intent on fighting these battles of encirclement to try to destroy the Red Army west of the Dnieper River. We're told again and again that was the goal for the campaign. But when I'm reading David Glantz's account of Barbarossa derailed, most of the panzer divisions, or a lot of the panzer divisions, aren't doing anything that could be loosely approximated as an encirclement. They're driving straight into the Soviet Union as far as they can and completely ignoring the encirclement battles that were supposedly taking place in this time. When I'm reading David Glantz and I'm seeing the movement of these panzer divisions, it doesn't make any sense given the traditional narrative. I wanted to learn more about that and to figure out what was the German army trying to do here. Unfortunately, in the secondary literature, basically no one addresses this question. There's a book in the 1970s by Matthew Cooper on the German army. He mentions how by the time of Operation Barbarossa, the German army had gotten away from the classical doctrine of Moltke the Elder, which was to attack concentrically and destroy the enemy army. Instead, this new notion had developed, well, we'll just drive as far into Soviet territory as we can, and that'll cause so much confusion in the enemy army that they'll just collapse. Well, other than, Matthew Cooper's book and, Barry Posen has a book on the sources of military doctrine, Michael Geyer mentions this topic very briefly in just basically one sentence in The Makers of Modern Strategy. There's really nothing else out there on this topic. So that left me with really nowhere else to go but the German archives and the writings of German generals and military theorists from, the period before the Second World War. What were they thinking about how to wage war in light of the lessons of the First World War? So when I'm reading the German archives of the campaign and seeing what objectives, the army group commanders and the general staff are setting for the campaign, when I'm reading the doctrines of the interwar military theorists, it's a completely different picture emerges from the traditional account of Barbarossa, which is, again, this, obsession with encirclements. In fact, the German army was almost obsessed to the point of not conducting encirclements. The man who sort of founded the German army after the First World War, Hans von Seeckt, gave this speech saying we have to reject the dogma of the envelopment. He thought before the First World War, under Schlieffen, the German army had developed this dogma of the envelopment where all tactics and strategy was reduced to encircling and destroying the enemy army. And I think the problem is when you declare that a dogma and then you say we can't follow that dogma anymore, then you create a dogma doing the exact opposite. And what sets into the German army's planning in the interwar period and during Barbarossa is the opposite of the dogma of envelopment. Instead, they have a dogma of we're just going to drive as far as we can into the Soviet Union, and surely that'll make the Soviets so confused and disorganized that we'll be able to exert our will upon them. And, what I found in my research is that simply didn't take place. If there was any, they call this a counter command effect or operational shock, where the appearance of a large body of your troops behind enemy lines creates confusion in the enemy headquarters and they don't know what to do. Well, I don't know that ever really took place in the Soviet high command, and to the extent it did, it didn't last very long because very quickly in the campaign, the Soviet Union was adjusting to the problem, counterattacking, hitting the panzer divisions and the infantry divisions in the flanks. And within a month, the Red Army has basically stopped Barbarossa in its tracks, brought the campaign to a halt, and arguably within a month, the campaign has failed. That doesn't mean it wasn't still possible to rectify the situation at that point. I think there were things the German army could have done. try to salvage the campaign much earlier. But in terms of their initial hopes for the campaign of having this, relatively easy walk or drive through the Soviet Union, that's at an end by the third week of July. So long before the mud and the winter and these other problems set in, Barbarossa, the initial plan has failed by the third week of July. And that's what I try to highlight in my book. I hope I get readers thinking about these tactical mistakes and getting away from this man against nature narrative into more of a army against army narrative.
I think that's a really good point. And, I've read lots and lots on Barbarossa in preparation for the podcast episodes on the campaign. And you're absolutely correct in that there's a lot of secondary sources where it almost feels like the Germans walked themselves to death and were just mowing down Red Army soldiers the whole time,
Right.
like with how it's
Right.
presented. And so, yeah, it is interesting to try and think about it in a different way than how it's usually presented. It's also interesting to hear you talk about the encirclement battles or looking at the encirclements and whether or not they were aiming for them or wanting them. Because one of the things I had always noticed is that for those early encirclement battles, it almost feels like the Germans don't even they aren't prepared and they don't necessarily know what to do once they encircle these armies, and suddenly they don't have the forces in the right place to deal with the resistance from those Soviet soldiers that are trapped inside of them.
No, it's incredible when you read the actual German planning documents for the campaign, how little they thought about actually fighting the enemy army. If you read German planning documents for Operation Barbarossa, the thinking is, well, number one, the thinking is terrain. They don't like the terrain in the Western Soviet Union. There's rivers and forests and swamps. So really, their sole concern almost is how can we get past this terrain? We want to get to the other side of the Dnieper River. We want to get east of Smolensk, because east of Smolensk, the terrain is much more open. There's not as many swamps. There's not as many rivers. And surely once the terrain is clear, then we'll be able to exert our will across the Soviet Union. And you're right. When the actual encirclement battle is happening, they're not thinking, Halder and the general staff aren't thinking, how do we maximize our prisoner yield from this battle? They're thinking, we've got to exploit this opportunity as soon as possible by advancing even farther and devoting the absolute minimum number of forces to liquidating these pockets. And the result is that a lot of Red Army soldiers are able to escape from the encirclement and get to the east, and these same forces that were potentially encircled are going to be causing them problems throughout the year and into the winter.
When you think about those actions that took place, the actual fighting around those situations, it was incredibly costly for the German forces. By the time you get to August, September, October, some of the German units are shadows of where they were when they started the campaign.
Right. I mean, even in the opening days, some of the infantry divisions that are attacking where the Red Army has managed to develop some fortified infrastructure along the border, some of the infantry divisions in the German army have to be withdrawn from combat in the first week of the campaign. And then, at Brody Dubno, if you read Alexei Azayev's book on it, some of the German panzer divisions suffered atrocious losses in their tanks in just the first week of the campaign. And then, Stahl makes the excellent point that in the month of July, the German army suffered the highest number of fatalities that it would for the next 2 years of the war until the Battle of Stalingrad. So the German army was suffering tremendous casualties from the beginning of the campaign. And, these aren't casualties from dust or poor infrastructure. They're casualties that are being inflicted by the Red Army because the generals in the German army aren't thinking about how to tactically optimize their force for fighting the Red Army, and they continue to make these mistakes throughout the campaign. It's kind of sad. You read some of the from the lower unit levels, like the Panzer divisions and the Panzer Corps in July, are complaining about the way they're being tactically handled, that they're just being, flung as deep into the Soviet Union as they can be, and then they're getting surrounded and attacked by the Red Army, suffering horrible casualties. They're sending these reports up saying, you cannot keep using us like this. And you take the 11th Panzer Division in Army Group South, again and again they say, we keep getting isolated and surrounded by the Red Army. You've got to stop doing this. And what does the German general staff do? They keep doing the same thing. Even after that, they keep doing the same thing to this 11th Panzer Division. And by the second half of August, they have to withdraw the 11th Panzer Division from combat because its strength has been depleted from being used in this tactically unoptimal manner. And the same thing with the 8th Panzer Division in the north. It's bizarre that the commanders of the army can be so out of touch with what the feedback they're getting from the lower level units at the front line.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up and kind of mishandling the panzer divisions as well, because that's also like such a big part of like the post-August story of Barbarossa, of how the Germans keep trying to do these things with the panzer divisions, but they are fractions of what they were at the start of the campaign. They can't replenish them fast enough. That's when the logistics really do start mattering, I think. And it's interesting to hear that it's not just the distance that they're driving. It's not just tanks breaking down that are causing these issues. It is fundamental mistakes at the German high command level that is contributing to their sort of lack of ability to do what they need them to do later on.
And that's another interesting aspect of the campaign, that it's usually told about, the diminishing strength of the German army. The German army close to its own borders is the best in the world. It can defeat any army. And then as it travels far, it gets weaker due to all these, factors like terrain and geography, and it can't fight with the same effectiveness that it did earlier. But I think the other side of that is, well, what about the Red Army? What role does the strength of the Red Army play in this? And something that I don't think gets enough attention is how incredibly weak, just quantitatively weak, the Red Army was on the first day of the invasion. Everyone talks about qualitative issues in the Red Army, the Great Purge, decimated the Soviet officer corps. And, most people ask, well, why did the Red Army fail in June? I think the number one answer we get is, well, the Great Purge, and then, secondarily, lack of, sort of rear area support, all these sort of secondary issues. Well, the most important thing in warfare in this period was having enough soldiers to cover your frontage. So a division at the time in the Soviet interwar regulations could cover, maybe on the defensive in an important sector, could cover maybe 8 to 10 kilometers, 5 kilometers if it was really an important sector. Well, John Erickson noted all the way back in the 70s that the average Soviet rifle division in June 1941 was covering 50 kilometers of frontage. So that's essentially no resistance at all. The reason the German army was successful in the beginning of the campaign is because how little opposition they were getting, how weak the Red Army was. I think the real story of Barbarossa's failure is the failure of the German army to exploit the weakness of the Red Army and keep it from increasing in size and increasing its force to space ratio. And very quickly, because what the Germans are doing is simply attacking frontally. They're just pushing Red Army units back where they're meeting reinforcements. And that's really the opposite of what you want to be doing in this campaign, because that's just making the Red Army stronger and stronger. So I think almost too emphasis is placed on the diminishing power of the German army, because even as late as October and even December, in its weakened state, the German army is still incredibly effective and able to fight and advance against the Red Army. It's really, I think, the critical factor here is the strength of the Red Army. When the Red Army is weak and doesn't have enough forces in a sector, then really no matter how weak the German army is, they're able to gather together enough forces and prioritize the fuel and ammunition in the right sectors to advance where they want to advance. It's when the Red Army develops a certain threshold of strength, then the German advance comes to a halt. And again, even later in the war, by July 1943, despite all the losses the German army had suffered, despite Stalingrad, the German army, Gregory Leakey wrote a great book about this in During the Whirlwind. By the eve of the Battle of Kursk, the German army had completely replenished all of its losses from the previous 2 years. But despite, and it had better tanks and everything by then too, but despite replenishing its strength, not only could it no longer attack, it couldn't even defend. And the reason for that is that the Red Army now fielded 6 million men concentrated on the front. The determining factor on the Eastern Front is really the strength of the Red Army, more so than the German army. So that's another aspect of the campaign I really wanted to hit home.
Yeah, I guess that the traditional stories always talk about it mostly from the German point of view of advancing further, getting weaker, that kind of stuff. But there's this incredible story of the Soviet Union and its ability at a leadership and military level to just like keep things at least kind of together, right? Could keep things together, keep falling back, keep finding more forces to put in the Germans' way, and then to keep getting better at countering what the Germans are doing.
Right. And then of course, the big figure on the Soviet side in that question is Stalin. Was the Soviet dictatorship under Stalin, did that save the Soviet Union? Did they need this strong leader, or was he really a hindrance? And, in my book, I argue strongly that he was an obstacle to the Soviet Union in every conceivable way, both in the preparation and planning for the campaign and then during the campaign. Stalin was not the Winston Churchill of the Soviet Union. He wasn't the lone voice of reason saying, we've got to prepare for war and industrialize. All the Bolsheviks knew early in the 1920s that war with the capitalist powers was coming. They knew they had to industrialize and get ready for a massive war of materiel against the Western powers. Stalin was not exceptional in this regard. I don't think the industrialization of the Soviet Union should be credited to him. That would have happened in any event. If Trotsky or someone else had been in charge, they would have been just as prepared. Stalin was an obstacle in this regard. And, during the campaign, he just makes things worse, particularly, of course, at the Battle of Kiev, where his commanders on the ground are warning him, we're being encircled, we have to withdraw. And Stalin stubbornly refuses to withdraw. So, I think if there's any remaining myth that Stalin might have somehow been a helpful influence in Soviet military preparation, I hope I've helped put that to rest in this book.
I think both sides, the militaries on both sides, were at some point afflicted by a dictator who demanded that his forces hold the line to disastrous results.
Yeah, and even to this day, okay, on the one hand, after the war, all the German generals blamed Hitler. And in recent scholarship, there's been some pushback saying, well, actually, Hitler had some good ideas. And anyone can have some good ideas. Putting them all together into a workable campaign plan is what matters. And in my book, I argue strongly that Hitler, I don't know if it was as bad as Stalin, but his campaign plan made no sense at all. Hitler was obsessed with taking the city of Leningrad out of almost purely economic consideration because he wanted to secure shipments of iron ore from Sweden, which, yes, Germany needed to secure shipments of iron ore from Sweden, but that's not going to win you a war against the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. In this aspect, Halder and the General Staff were correct that the goal for the campaign needed to be to eliminate the Soviet Union as fast as possible. And, Hitler was a major hindrance in that regard. He got the Battle of Kiev right, but, he had many other poor ideas. Mainly, this obsession with taking Leningrad kind of thwarted any ability to bring the campaign to a successful conclusion early on.
Yeah, and speaking of terrain, the areas around Leningrad, from everything I've read, were not awesome terrain for what the German military was trying to do.
No, the last thing you want to be doing is sending all of your panzer divisions to Leningrad because there's no mobility there. The strength of the panzer divisions isn't their firepower, it's their ability to maneuver. And at Leningrad, everyone says the expanding funnel of the front is the reason the Germans lost it. There was too much space. Well, I think the expanding funnel actually favored the Germans because they had numerical superiority and superior mobility. So the more space they have to maneuver, the better. The problem when you get to Leningrad is you're running out of all this space. And you look at a map of how densely concentrated all these panzer divisions are around Leningrad with nowhere to maneuver. They try these frontal assaults. You have 3 panzer divisions attacking a suburb of Leningrad in August, and they get repulsed because they're not built for this head-on attack against fortified, entrenched positions. So Hitler's idea for the campaign was, first thing I'm going to do is send all or most of Army Group Center's panzer divisions to the north to Leningrad, which turns out to be a complete disaster because now they're not available elsewhere in the campaign where they can actually utilize their mobility to encircle and destroy the Red Army.
This is your fix.
I'm your host, Stassi Schroeder. Welcome to Tell Me Lies, the official podcast. What's the most unhinged thing of season 3?
Steven, because he's so evil.
I do think he is misunderstood.
You see everyone face consequences. It's intoxicating.
The writers just know how to trick you.
There's always a twist in this show.
Tell Me Lies, the official podcast, January 6th, and stream the new season of Tell Me Lies, January 13th on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
If you're interested in what's happening in the world of technology, you will love our Roundtable News Show, This Week in Tech. Hi, this is Leo Laporte. Every Sunday, I bring the best tech journalists together to talk about the week's tech news. This week, the showdown between Anthropic and the Department of Defense, Apple's big week ahead, Samsung's new phone, and a whole lot more. Join me this week and every week for Twit. You'll find it at our website, twit.tv, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Wade, we've talked a little bit about German expectations, German planning going into the campaign. You know, how important or how much did it contribute to the eventual failure that they were on such a run of success by 1941, right? Poland, France, even other areas, like it'd been nothing but victories. And do you think that people often talk about like victory disease, essentially, when trying to explain the failure of Barbarossa? Where do you think that ranks kind of on the contributing factors?
I argue in my book, I argue that wasn't really much of a factor. I look at I try to trace the development of German army doctrine in the interwar period. And basically by 1939, in the spring of 1939, the chief of the general staff in Germany, Franz Halder, has formulated this doctrine of how to employ the panzer divisions, which it sounds absurd to say it, but it's simply drive in a straight line toward a key geographic objective. And, the infantry divisions following behind will take care of the enemy army. And that's what they do in Poland. And immediately in Poland, when they try to do this, you have Guderian drives in a straight line all the way across Poland into eastern Poland, well on the other side of the demarcation line with the Soviet Union, bypassing the Polish army. And the bypassed Polish army units come crashing into the German flank. And it creates this tremendous problems for the German army in September. You would think the German army would have learned, oh, well, this idea doesn't work. But they completely ignore it, Everyone talks about this, the German army's great learning process. They commissioned a study after the Polish campaign to figure out what went wrong during the campaign. And, they analyzed what the lower level units were doing wrong, what the infantry and artillery were doing wrong. Nobody questions Halder's doctrine for how to handle armies in Poland, even though it was a glaring, obvious mistake. And then they try the same exact thing in France, where Halder says, I'm just going to drive in a straight line, essentially toward Paris. And Hitler interferes and said, no, actually, I think it would be a good idea to turn north and envelop the British-French armies. Halder complains, but, it's one of the greatest military successes in history, where they envelop, over 1.5 million enemy soldiers. And while they have this great success, Halder is complaining in his diary because now the French have set up a new line of resistance. And yeah, the Germans incur a lot of casualties fighting the next phase of the campaign, but they wouldn't have succeeded if they just kept driving in a straight line. I think the campaign in 1940 would have failed, just like the campaign in 1941 failed. So the idea that the victory disease was the problem here, I really don't see that as an issue here. I think the Germans looked at the campaigns in the First World War, what worked and what didn't. Where in the First World War, they actually tried at one point kind of, okay, let's have a small sort of tactical, very narrow focus on defeating the enemy army. And that's what Falkenhayn tried to do at the Battle of Verdun. And that didn't work at all. Whereas in contrast, on the Eastern Front, Hans von Seeckt was the chief of staff of the 11th Army, and he said, he originated this idea, well, let's just drive in a straight line into the enemy rear. And it actually worked. under the very specific set of circumstances in 1915. And then, I cite a book by Isabel Hall called Absolute Destruction, where she talks about this idea of military culture and how military bureaucracies can become ossified in their ways of thinking based on what worked in the past, and then sort of traumatic experiences where all they can think about is how do we avoid trauma. Well, the great trauma, of course, for the German army was the November Revolution, the so-called stab in the back in November 1918, where supposedly the German army stood undefeated on the field, but the revolutionaries at home stabbed them in the back. So that sort of blinds the German army to the real lessons of the First World War, which is that the British and French had figured out, actually, if you successfully execute small tactical attacks, the British called it fight and hold, where, advance 1 mile a day is basically what they advanced in the 100 Days Offensive. That actually works and can rapidly deplete and destroy an enemy army. Hull notes in her book that, the Germans completely ignored that lesson, and actually, the Germans actually thought, well, you're only advancing 1 mile a day. What kind of success is that? Well, the distance doesn't matter. It's destroying the enemy army that matters. If after 100 days you've destroyed most of the enemy army, then the rest of the enemy country is going to be open to you. So I think the First World War, the lessons of the First World War, and then sort of the military culture of the German army, and then there's also this broader social construct, social structure in Germany, where the sort of network of families of German generals and officers who have been in power, in command of the Prussian army for centuries, their network of families stays in power, and they're still in power after Hitler takes over. And I think, part of their motive was they weren't just interested in Germany winning the war. They wanted to win the war and have their network, their social caste, stay in power. So I think that and the military culture and then the sort of trauma from their past experiences combine to create these barriers to rational planning where they don't rationally look at what actually, Hans von Zech, gets all this credit for supposedly commissioning a study to analyze what happened in the First World War. And he wrote these regulations based on that study. Well, I mean, you read the regulations that Zech wrote, they completely ignore the success of what actually worked in 1918. How the Allies won in 1918 was with small tactical advances that the methodical battle doctrine worked in 1918. That's completely ignored in Zech's regulations, and instead he's focused on, well, you've got to punch through the enemy line and just keep advancing as far as you can. So, I mean, it's a fascinating question, and I don't think it's really gotten any attention, and I hope my book is drawing attention to this aspect of German military doctrine in the 20th century, and that scholars will pay more attention to it.
My own personal history. I did a First World War podcast before I started on my Second World War podcast. So I've done lots and lots of reading and research about the First World War. And thinking about it, I think there's certainly some similarities between the 1918 German offensives in the spring and Barbarossa, where it's just they enter the offensive with the idea of we just have to punch through the line. We have to walk or drive, depending on the war, as far as we can, and everything will take care of itself. And guess what? It doesn't.
Exactly. Right. All they do is create, in 1918, the German offensive just creates these salients.
Yeah.
And one of the things I emphasize in my book is, military theory, 19th century military theory. And this problem was identified as early as the 18th century. I talk a lot about this military theorist named Dietrich Heinrich von Bülow, Prussian military theorist. Even in the 18th century, it was apparent to him that the way armies were evolving, heavily dependent on supply lines of communication, that if you just drive in a straight line toward a distant geographic objective, then you're just going to create this salient in enemy lines, and you're going to have to deploy so many forces to defend the flanks of the salient. You're not going to have enough residual strength to continue the advance. And that's exactly what happens in 1918. It happens again in 1941. And, I think a lot of the problem is that Bülow was tempted to be rebuked by another famous theorist, Karl von Clausewitz, who actually said, Bülow, we don't really care about your concerns. We're just going to drive in a straight line. Clausewitz really literally wrote, just drive in a straight line into the heart of the enemy state, and that's the most you can do. And somehow Clausewitz became the dominating force in German military theory for the next century. And you read the interwar writings of the German general staff, and all these general staff officers in Germany feel the need to cite Clausewitz in support of their ideas whenever they can. And Hans von Zayt writes glowingly about Clausewitz in the interwar period. And you can see the influence of Clausewitz on the German army during the campaign. You read Halder's diary, all these threats to the flanks develop, and Halder in his diary basically quotes Clausewitz and saying, well, these are the kind of problems that will inevitably arise, and you just have to ignore them and press on ahead, which just doesn't make any sense. So I spend a lot of time trying to debunk the influence of Clausewitz and arguing that, Bülow and other military theorists had better ideas, and we really need to get away from this idea of idolizing Clausewitz as a source of inspiration. Unfortunately, his influence still persists today on the U.S. military, and a lot of writers still feel the need to cite him as a source of doctrine. I'm not saying everything he wrote is wrong. Everyone has some good ideas and bad ideas. We need to assess them critically and not just say, well, this guy, he's the gold standard for military theory. Let's think, how can we solve a 21st century problem based on what someone in the 1820s thought about war?
I think sometimes it runs into the same problem that like the German von Siegt after the First World War ran into, where he pulled, like, you cherry pick examples that support things you already think and believe, and talk about how amazing those examples are and how amazing they are and apply to all these other things that you want them to apply to. And you just kind of ignore all the other stuff.
Yeah, it's incredible I say in the book how incredible it is that in a country as smart as Germany that produced all these brilliant minds over the centuries, that their military leadership could be, frankly, so incompetent and not rationally think about how to wage war in the 21st century. And I contrast it, with the Soviet Union, where they, all these great theorists in the interwar period thought about exactly these problems and spent the 2 decades between the wars thinking, how do we overcome this problem of, the continuous front and the million-man armies? And I think Soviet deep operations theorists got it basically right. And, the Germans were aware of their writings, but just kind of dismissed it as saying, well, they've got a very narrow schematic view of the world, and they can't think about what will happen if circumstances change. And when some group of German general staff officers say, well, we should try to rationalize our doctrine, they're rebuked by the higher ups in the general staff, who say, well, the anointing oil of commanding armies cannot be poured into bottles. And that's the end of it. So they reject outright the notion of trying to develop a rational approach to leading armies. And they get away with it against Poland and France, but it results in a tremendous failure against the Soviet Union.
Sometimes it feels like the German military leaders sort of buy into their own hype a little bit too much when being able to think critically about events of the past. They always assume that the Germans did the correct thing. The German military leaders at that time did the correct thing, and kind of work from that position.
Yeah, they definitely overestimate the prowess of their predecessors, of Frederick the Great, of Clausewitz, of Moltke the Elder, and then demonstrate an inability to think rationally and critically about how circumstances have changed and what we need to do different based on, changes in technology and society. And part of that is, at the German General Staff Academy, the officers didn't receive a well-rounded education in the humanities and sciences. They received a very technical education. Now, that's not to say they ignored problems of politics and economics. They thought, in their campaign planning, the German generals thought very intently, almost too much about politics and economics, but I don't think they developed a rational understanding of how society as a whole was changing and the influence that had on warfare. They tried to retain methods from the 19th century and apply them in the 20th century to achieve political and economic effects, but without understanding how modern politics and sociology had in turn changed the nature of warfare.
Coming up here on the end of our interview, I always like to ask. So this book, I'm sure, is a multi-year, set of work for you through the research and the writing, and now coming up on release. What is one, or do you have a specific opinion or thought or idea that has really changed for you over the course of all this work? That you came into this project thinking one thing, and maybe you've shifted your mindset or had it, really reaffirmed coming out the other side?
I guess one thing, I wasn't sure about going into the project was, the role of Stalin. Like, was he a beneficial factor for the Soviet Union? People argue that, he created this solid regime that withstood the German invasion, and I think I've pretty decisively concluded after reading about it more that Stalin was a negative influence. He was not helpful in any way to the Soviet cause, and they'd have been much better off without him. That really the only reason Barbarossa succeeded at all. I think you can really lay at the feet of Stalin. He was a disaster for the Soviet Union. And there's really no defending any of his actions. He didn't help them prepare. He didn't help them respond to the invasion. Everything Stalin did was meant to benefit one person, and that was Joseph Stalin. He didn't care how many tens of millions of his people died, as long as he emerged from the conflict unscathed. So that's something I wasn't entirely sure about going in, but the more I read about it, the more clear it became that he was the problem on the Soviet side.
I think people's views on him, a lot of different views, but from a military perspective, I think oftentimes people work backwards from the results, right? They see eventual Soviet victory and start backdating, like interpreting his decisions based on that eventual victory, which I think is very favorable for him, but maybe not always accurate. So now that we're coming up to the end of this project for you, comes out in a few days. What's kind of on the horizon for you? What is the next sort of research that you're tackling, book that you're writing?
Well, I found far more material in my research than I could cover in this book. I wanted to keep it to a reasonable length, and I had to cut out a lot of material that I would have liked to include. So I'm already working on my next book about Operation Barbarossa that will go into these issues in a lot more detail. And I'm looking forward to that coming out, hopefully in the near future.
The one truth about the Second World War on the Eastern Front is that there is mountains of material out there to look through.
It's amazing how much, after 8 decades, how much has not been explored and how much hasn't been published. I think we're going to be learning a lot more about this campaign in the next decade or two.
Okay, I think we're at the end here. Timothy, thank you so much for joining us here and chatting about your new book, Why Barbarossa Failed.
Great, thank you for having me.